I just want to welcome everyone for coming today to Roaring Fork Leadership's Resiliency Experience, and I'm so thrilled to have David Chrislip with us today. I've known David Chrislip, I think, I'm looking at my certificate that has the date, since 2005. I met him when I was in the American Leadership Forum, and he brought a conversation around community leadership and civic leadership, and was just really excited to have made a recent connection with him to kind of revive that conversation. And he was willing to offer to speak today, total as a contribution to the Academy. He's even doing research currently on this community problem solving. He'll get into a lot of that. He's authored one of my go-to books, if I can get it in the screen, Collaborative Leadership Field Book. In my opinion, he is one of the forerunners in any conversation around community leadership. He's worked with Kansas City Leadership, KLC, Kansas Leadership Center, as well as other organizations, really honing in on what does this mean and how can we do more of it and be better at it. So again, these RFL Resiliency Experience are every Tuesday, noon to 1. We're offering these up for free. We've been doing it since May, and it is one of RFL's givebacks to the community, because in different speakers are bringing in different topics of like, how can we be resilient? And David, when I think of your topic, it's really kind of how do we recover, right, from adversity? How do we solve community change when we are in situations very similar to COVID or just on a regular basis? And in the Roaring Fork Valley, housing, Nan's working, I know, very diligently on a project up in Pitkin County, and well, it's really valley-wide on sustainable housing and, traffic or transportation, affordable housing, equality. There's all these issues that are probably equal, in a lot of different communities. But with that, I don't want to take up a lot of time that David has prepared for us, because I think we're going to have some great input and feedback and thoughts today. So David, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to you so we can have a great hour talking about community-driven change and civic capacity.
Okay, well, Andrea, thank you very much for the invitation. This is a timely one for me too. We just finished the first phase of a research project on community-driven change and civic capacity. So this is a good chance for me to start communicating some of these ideas with people who these ideas may be important to and who work with them. What I thought I'd do in our time is we'll break this up in 3 parts. The first piece of it, I want to put in some ideas about community-driven change, what it means, why it's important, why it's seems to be prominent at this moment. We'll stop at the end of that first section, get some clarifying questions, ideas, and so on in it. Then I want to go on in a second part of this to put some ideas in from this research that we've been doing on civic capacity. The research has been focused around, well, if that's what community-driven change looks like, what kind of civic capacities do communities need in order to produce change from within, in order to respond to challenges from within? And then we'll stop again with and have some time for some questions and thoughts, observations. And then what I'd like to do at the last, the sort of a third piece of our research has been to develop a civic capacity assessment tool. We call it the Civic Capacity Index. And I'd like to see if we can manage to do that in a brief and quick way while we're online here, in part just to test how it works and to see what kind of information or insights it might provide you. So that's all in part to let you know that for me, this is a bit of an experiment, and I would really appreciate your feedback about this, about the ideas, what helps and hinders communicating these ideas, how did the assessments that I have in here work for you, And we may not have time for you to give me that feedback on this session, but you can forward that through Andrea, and she will get it back to me. So anyway, I'm looking forward to it for that reason too, just a chance to experiment with you all. So about what this work is about. So let me start with this. Let me see if I can figure out how I. There we go. To start with some observations about community-driven change. So one of the things that we had noticed, and partly a catalyst for some of the research that we were doing, was that over the past, say, couple of decades or so, there's been a notable shift in impetus about where people think about who provides the impetus for change in communities. Should it come from experts? Should it come from the political leaders? Should it come from the community itself? This shift, we can notice this shift. We can see it in the rhetoric of public agencies of wanting to move to what they call community-driven change. We can see it in the rhetoric of foundations of wanting to aspiring to community-driven change to manage their interventions. And we can see that too in other organizations that are interested in working in the communities. Now, how this first came, well, I'm not sure first is the right word. This really came to my attention a couple of years ago. I was working with a health foundation in Kansas. They had an initiative to enhance health equity in Kansas counties. And they had 17 Kansas counties as part of this program. Their intent, or their aspirational intent, their rhetoric was that these counties should decide themselves what to do about health equity in those counties and inequities that were in those counties. They wanted these policies, these changes, whatever came out of their intervention. They wanted them to be driven from within the community. In fact, they went so far as to suggest that they wanted these to be resident driven. Well, my work with them a couple of years ago was to take a look at what they were up to in these 17 counties. It's really 17 different interventions, each with a team of technical assistance people, facilitators, and so on. And to see how well, to see if we could assess how well these interventions reflected that aspiration of being driven from within the community. I put up a spectrum. Well, let me go a little bit different direction. We'll come back to that in a minute. So one of the things that's come out of this impetus to move towards community-driven change, an emerging definition of what it looks like. And you can see it here on the screen. You know, it really looking at a more inclusive, collaborative, engaging participation of diverse people, focus on equitable outcomes, decision-making processes that are fair, authentic, and transparent. This is an emerging definition from foundations and from public agencies about what this means. Now, the one thing that we could say about it, at least certainly at the time I was working with this foundation, is we had this definition of what community-driven change might mean at its best, but we really didn't know much about what that looked like in practice. So what I did with that community, well, let me, one more thing before we go there again. And so one of the reasons that this shift to community-driven change has been occurring is, at least in the eyes of foundations and some public agencies and some research, is that it seems to be more effective in making lasting progress. Policies, interventions, and so on that are developed by the community seem to be more sustainable than those that are implemented by experts, by community, by foundations, by government agencies, and so on. Also, it's more inclusive and it's egalitarian, so it seems to be more democratic. And one thing that we've been noting in the last few years is that communities that are able to respond to challenges and disruptions from within are observably more resilient and responsive to these disruptions and challenges. Observably more responsive and resilient to that. So my question for the foundation was this. I said, well, let's put this spectrum up on the board, this long arrow in the middle there. And let's just put a definition of, say, on the left hand side here, a top-down or expert-driven approach to community change. On the right-hand side, a community-driven approach to the challenges in that community. I asked each of these teams from these various 17 counties to place it, given that definition that we just showed you of community-driven change, I asked them to place this on this spectrum. Now, what was, I think, startling to the foundation and most of us that were participating in that, I mean, is you may be able to guess where most of those interventions came out on this spectrum. Most of those interventions were placed over on the left end of this spectrum here. A couple of observations about that. You know, that when you ask these teams to describe what they were up to, you found that usually it was a very small group of people, often experts, sometimes the usual voices, the usual community-driven, or excuse me, the usual leaders that show up quite often in communities, the usual public agencies and foundations that were driving these change, despite the aspiration for community-driven change. So one of the things that we learned from this was that we really didn't have a very good definition of what community-driven change meant or what it looked like in practice. So the practice was not matching the aspiration to do this. And I thought, I'm curious just to do this really quickly here, just to ask you all a couple of questions about the Roaring Fork Valley. And one of them is this left-hand question there. Where would you place your understanding of civic engagement in Roaring Fork Valley? Is it more to the left? Is it more to the right? And then we'll come to a subsequent question here in a moment. And I assume, let's see, we have a chat here.
The chat is available. You just have
a chat. So, you know, if you could just, we're not going to dwell on this at this moment. We'll keep going with the conversation here. But if you could just post in your chat there some idea more towards the left, more towards the right, in the middle. What's your sense of where the Roaring Fork Valley is?
I got left of center towards the left. I got 2 comments. If you're seeing these.
Yep, I've got that up here, I think. And
yep, left, more to the left, middle.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you know, once you posted about where you think it is, where would you like it to be in the Roaring Fork Valley? And I don't know if I distinguished those well enough on the chat here, but I think we'll get the information we need out of this.
Yep. More right.
So, you know, just from a quick look at this, that most of you would place Roaring Fork Valley more towards the left end of this spectrum. Some of it maybe left middle side of this spectrum. And that the aspiration is to move over to the middle, I assume, or to the right on this.
More to the right. Lots of to the rights.
To the right. Okay. So, okay, well, just hold on to that a minute, you know, in terms of where you put yourselves on this spectrum here. And we're going to go on to a different dimension here. So one of the questions that came out of this was that, or the observations that we made, again, that we really didn't know what community change looked like in practice. We didn't have a shared definition of what that meant. We didn't have any idea what were the civic capacities communities need in order to produce community-driven change. So I'm going to come on to, so one of a piece of a research project that grew out of that work with the Colorado State University. We had three things that we wanted to do with this research project. We wanted to create a broader understanding of community-driven change. So we'd have a better definition of it, a more consensus about what it meant. And we wanted to be able to define, we wanted to be able to define the civic capacities communities needed and what these capacities look like in practice. So what would you really see if a community was able to produce change from within, was able to respond to challenges in a way that mirrored that definition or that aspiration for community-driven change? The third part of it is that we wanted to develop a diagnostic tool, a civic capacity index that we could use to assess the civic capacity, the relative civic capacity of places in order to help us shape, inform, and evaluate community interventions. So just a few notes on the research methodology, what we did with this. We had some case studies, a couple of good sets of case studies that some good researchers had done about community-driven change and civic capacity, and we took advantage of those. But we also wanted to convene some experts, an expert panel of people who had both practical and or scholarly experience with these ideas about community-driven change and civic capacity. We convened a group of 34 experts from across the country, mostly from the US, a couple from Canada. And the central research question that we asked them was just this: what would you see if community-driven change was occurring? Given your experience, what would you see? They came back to us with about 750 or so observations about this. Many of those observations repeated themselves from different people, saw the same things. So our first task was to eliminate the duplicates out of this research, consolidate it. We ended up with about 170 statements about what community-driven change would look like from this expert panel. We asked them to take those 170 statements and we asked them to group those like ideas with like ideas. We used what's called a concept mapping approach. And so each of these people would take this group of statements and just work with them until they were comfortable that they ended up with piles of ideas about like ideas with like ideas. We were able, there's a computer statistical program called, I think it's called multi-dimensional scaling, that you can take all this input and you could put it into the program and to take these sortings by each of these 34 people and reach a composite sort, which would identify the domains, the different sort of subdomains of what civic capacity meant. So here's where we'll go next. Is here's what came out of that. We ended up with 7 groupings of what community-driven change and civic capacity look like in practice. So and I'll just go over these quickly in a sort of summary fashion, and then I want to come back and ask you to do a quick assessment. For example, the Roaring Fork Valley, and we'll explore what that might mean. So let's take a look at the civic collective leadership. First of all, this was a really interesting domain. I mean, we knew that leadership would come up as a central domain of civic capacity, or a central answer to this question. But the definition came out in a different way than we anticipated. It was much less focused on individual leaders and individual agency, although that's not unimportant or not insignificant here. But the way that leadership was defined in these answers was, it's quite a different view of leadership, is looking at leadership is as the collective capacity of a social system, like a community or a neighborhood, the collective capacity of a social system to respond to challenges. That's a different conception of leadership than the conception of leadership embodied in a person or an entity. As a person is an entity here. So it's the ideas, the idea there, what seemed to be behind it, again, a very different view of leadership as a collective, as a characteristic of a social system, the collective capacity to respond to changes. And a few, 2 or 3 defining things about what collective leadership meant. One of the pieces of it is that there were many people exercising leadership, some with authority, many without. So in collective leadership, many people exercising leadership, some with authority, many without. So leadership in some ways is seen as an activity rather than a position. It's something that it detaches leadership from position and authority and influence, and says that leadership is an activity that's available to anyone if they so choose to use it, regardless of position. And that much of this activity of leadership was directed towards building bridges across factions and managing constructive processes for people to engage. A second feature that we found, and we'll stop at the end. If you have questions or thoughts or clarifying thoughts, we'll have time for that. The second thing that was really interesting to us too, and surprising too, was the observation that communities that do better at responding to challenges and disruptions like the coronavirus are consciously and intentionally dealing with issues like racism and systemic inequities. The more that they are able to do that in a conscious, intentional way makes them better at responding to disruptions and challenges. So it was surprising for us in that it came out so prominently in the answers to this question: what do you see when community-driven change is occurring? And it makes sense when you think about it, but it doesn't usually seem to come up with such prominence. Communities that are better able to deal with inequity, systemic inequities, racism, and so on, are of course better able to deal with other challenges that they confront. They're able to deal in a deeper, more effective, more constructive way. A third part of this was we could see some institutional synergy, that the institutions with the community shared some ideas about community engagement and valued community engagement. And when I say institutions here, I'm talking about, multi-sector institutions, public institutions, foundations, business organizations, nonprofit organizations, all had some shared value that civic engagement, community-driven change was important to them, and we're able to support it. We're able to invest in it and support it. A fourth piece of this is that these places were characterized by an engaging civic culture. And here's where we bring in some of the more traditional measures of civic capacity. For example, social capital. That's where this comes in here. Our networks that facilitate our capacity to work together, facilitate our capacity to collaborate with each other, our relationships amongst each other that facilitate our capacity to work together for the common good. And this goes back and is very complementary to Robert Putnam's work on social capital that I suspect many of you know about and are familiar with. A fourth piece of this that came out of it was this capacity to sort of organically produce coalitions to respond to challenges. That communities that were on the higher side of civic capacity had a kind of an uncanny knack when something came up. Coalitions just started to begin to form in a pretty organic sort of a way. One person starts talking to another, and another person talks to another, and pretty soon you started to form a coalition that might address or make some progress on whatever the presenting issues was. A sixth thing that came out is that because of when these other things that we've talked about are in place, was that collaboration became purposeful, that it was intentional. It was not collaborating because we have to, because we don't have any other choices. It was just something that people had become attuned to doing when there were big issues in play, that you turn to a collaborative, engaging approach to work with those. And that's what I was writing about in that book that Andrea introduced at the start, the Collaborative Leadership Field Book. And the last piece of this was that this was all characterized by a sort of a mindset of learning together. It was not so much an ideological battle or an expert battle between positions, but that these were adaptive challenge, in Ronnie Heifetz's words, that required us to learn together how to respond to them. And so it was also characterized by the capacity to experiment. We'll try this. If it doesn't work, we're going to back off. We'll try something else. Now, at the end of this, what also became clear to us out of this conversation is that in the end, there was a synergistic relationship between these 7 parts. And I'm just going to stick there. There was this, that you couldn't pull each of these out in isolation. They were sort of systemically connected with each other. And the other piece of this too, that we got out of this, was some sort of caveats, I guess, that we should place on these findings. And some of these caveats went like this, is that one size doesn't fit all. Different communities had different mixes of these elements here. Some communities had strengths in one area and not so much in the other. That nobody's perfect. Nobody puts all these together and reflects them all in community interventions. That sometimes that civic capacity, sometimes responses to challenges are proactive, sometimes they're reactive. Sometimes you're forced into dealing with a problem, not because you choose to, you just have to. Pandemic is an example of that. We're sort of forced into that. That these initiatives progress in fits and starts. There's not, it's not sort of a continuous line of progress here. That these initiatives can start from the bottom up or the top down, and somewhere in between. Sometimes the traditional institutions that we see in communities are the place where it starts. Sometimes it starts out of community activism. So a couple of things too. These civic decisions are always in some ways sort of tentative and progress fleeting. There was one observation that one of the people made, that is, one thing leads to another. It's never over. So when we're talking about civic issues and civic engagements And we hope that we'll end up with some static place. All this said is that we're not likely to end up in some static place. But if we were able to marshal some of these capacities in a better way, perhaps than we do now, we are more likely to make progress than if we don't. So I'll stop with that. And Andrea, if you might just give me a little heads up, how are we doing all right on time here?
You have 30 minutes left.
Okay, good. And so just to open up to you all, to questions, observations, something needs to be clarified, what else did we learn on the research, whatever.
I had a question. It all makes so much sense, and some of the organizations and nonprofits that have been really impressive to me have seemed to have followed this same course and brought in these components. So I'm wondering, in contrast, what is an example of a community that, for example, that doesn't deal with inequity and injustice and racism really well? Like I'm trying to picture, because I know of communities that have done it well. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of, I would love an example, maybe on the front range, of communities that don't do it well, and you continue to see, maybe it's still there, but it's below the surface, right?
Yeah. So let me give a quick answer, and it won't be on the front range because we're just starting to explore what's going on here in Colorado. And just for your information, one of the pieces that we're exploring now is we've asked CDPHE, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, to help us identify for some pilot testing of this work, 10 communities across Colorado that cover a spectrum of those that seem to have responded well to the pandemic, those versus those who've not responded so well. So we're just starting into that now. But on a larger scale, one example that you might look at is the responses to these hurricanes and superstorms, say, of the last 15 years or so, that you might contrast, for example, the response of New York and New Jersey to Superstorm Sandy. You might contrast that to Katrina, for example, in New Orleans, or you might contrast it, was it Harvey in Puerto Rico, and you might contrast Houston, where people would observably note differences in those areas' responses to these storms. And most people would say, yes, New York and New Jersey responded better than Puerto Rico, for example. So I'll just, and so the question, the questions that grew out of that is, okay, can we pinpoint that? Why? Why are those different so drastically? Why do they differ so drastically? Can we define those in some, define those differences? Can we understand them in a deeper way? That was the intent of our research, really.
David, Nan put in the chat, wondering where shared vision fits.
Yeah.
Also, we have so many initiatives, right, to coordinate. And Nan, I'll even say that that's been a topic that I've been it's a couple years old, but it's kind of percolating again because of COVID, right? It's like all these nonprofits or all these government entities that are out there trying to solve, let's say, these problems, but yet there's aspects of silo going on. So Nan's question again is, like, where does shared vision come in?
Yeah, well, that was a really interesting one. In the responses to this, we didn't have any response that mentioned vision or shared vision out of those 700 summaries. And here now, and I don't think we have this fully sorted out yet. But part of it means that so many of the issues that we're dealing with here need a sort of like the pandemic. The first needs are systemic, and they're sort of emergency. They're symptomatic. They're sort of emergency responses. They're not. They're not. We don't need a shared vision at the start. We need experts to tell us what we need to do and get on with it as quickly as we can do that. Now, shared vision seems to come in more in the longer term responses and recovery to this. Now, it showed up, it's not to say that, well, the words didn't show up in this. It's not to say that some of the ideas that are behind shared vision did show up in this, because, and they showed up in such ways, well, the outcomes of community-driven change is a shared definition of what the problem is, and a shared, excuse me, a shared description of what the solutions ought to be. So, I'm not sure if I'm getting to the responding to your question, but it seems, shared vision didn't come up specifically. Some of the ideas behind shared vision did, and it seems to come up more as the response progresses. You develop some deeper agreement, whether it's a shared vision, whether it's a shared definition of what the problem is. You develop some deeper agreement about what it is you're up to and what are you going to do about it. Your point, this was a really interesting one on also, we have so many initiatives. How do you coordinate so many initiatives here? One of the things that we picked up on this, it seems to be that there is a role of civic leadership in communities to help prioritize and frame issues that need this deeper engagement, because we all know that we can't practically address all issues in the way that we described earlier, that aspiration for community-driven change. People don't have the time for it, they don't have the inclination for it, they don't have the energy for it. So one of the roles of civic leadership is how do you pick out and prioritize those issues where you really do need that deeper engagement, and how do you see to it that the other issues that don't perhaps need that engagement do get attended to by the appropriate institutions and organizations that ought to be responsible for those things, and sometimes they're not. But so we take a couple more minutes here if there's some other, clarifying questions, thoughts about these ideas.
Just reflect a little bit on what you just spoke about. First of all, this is excellent. Really, really good information. Thank you. It's interesting, the question around vision and coordination, and then looking at these 7 domains you have. And one way to maybe think about that question, because we do a lot of work, I work with a nonprofit called Community Builders, and we do a lot of work on these domains and building local capacity and civic culture, but also in pursuit of community vision and strategy. And the vision itself can be really useful for being able to do things, but it's also really useful unless you are responding to, you mentioned like the responses to natural disasters and things like that. Those are things that can bring together and test and strengthen, in certain cases, civic culture and civic capacity. But in the absence of that, we also want to be building these things in other times too. And I think that sometimes vision, while it should also point towards an end, in a weird way, it can be a means to building these things. And in fact, it can be something that creates that thing that we also create the coordination around. I'm helping a nearby county to one in the Roaring Fork Valley think through some of these things right now, and literally watching them struggle with some of these very issues and the lack of coordination between different efforts. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because you see the challenges reflected in these domains, and where they're trying to get to is this place where they do have a coherent and shared vision that they can unify these elements around. And then conversely, as sort of and they're struggling, but they'll get there. A positive example is, Gunnison County did the One Valley Prosperity Project a couple of years ago, and it was one part build community vision and create the sort of collaborative networks and supports to, enable and advance that vision and continue to steward it. But it was also there was a lot of work that went into leadership development and the civic capacity work that you're talking about here. And I just think these reflections of what you have here is so spot on in terms of what we see on the ground in different places, that it's really good. It is interesting that vision didn't come out, because I do think that that's a component. But again, maybe it's because these are kind of like the framework or the infrastructure, and the vision is a thing that sometimes that can be help tighten that infrastructure. I don't know.
No, I think that's a good way to put it. Vision helps you manifest these things, you know, coordinate these things, pull these things together, focus these things. I think part of it too reflected for some of these practitioners, the fact that vision has sometimes been an obstacle, creating a shared vision has sometimes been an obstacle to community-driven change. And it's been an obstacle, because the polarization has been so great, you just simply can't get there. And so, which doesn't necessarily, because you couldn't get a shared vision, doesn't necessarily preclude the idea of collaboration on how are we going to deal with this problem or this issue. It doesn't preclude that. The other piece of it is that sometimes that a shared vision has become, it's a way to get some broader agreement about something, but the agreement is so shallow and so broad and so abstract that it is meaningless or becomes meaningless when you turn to action. And so a piece of it, I think, just reflects the diversity of the experience of many of these people with the idea of shared vision. You know, it can be useful. Well, that's probably enough on that. Unless there's a pressing question, what I'd like to do now is see if we can do a quick assessment of civic capacity on these 7 dimensions in the Roaring Fork Valley, and just open up a conversation about what the implications of this assessment might be. So are you game for it? Good, okay. So here we go. I'm going to ask you on you can see here collective leadership. There's some, I sort of, gave a summary of what those descriptions are. What I would like you to very quickly do, and back in your chat, and let's see if we can chat. Good for you, Andrea. Collective leadership. Response to that on this scale, is this something you always see, something that looks like this in the Roaring Fork Valley? Is it something you never see, or somewhere in between? And just a quick, put a number up there about where you think it is. I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds. Great. Okay, let's go to the next one here. The next one is confronting racism and systemic injustice. Or confronting systemic injustice. There's the definition again, the scale there. Okay, and we'll go to the next one here. Institutional synergy.
Twos, threes, a few fours in there.
Yep. Okay. Let's go on to the next one, engaging civic culture.
Two, 2, 3. We got a 5 from Jonathan. Jonathan, you're privately messaging me. You can change that to everyone for your scores. 2s and 3s.
Sorry, thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Okay, good. All right, we'll jump on ahead here. Organic coalitions.
Four, 3, 3.5. Another 4, 4.
Good, good.
4s. 3.
All right, now we'll go on. Here we are, purposeful collaboration.
Or 3. Gardner 3. 3s. 4.5. 1, 5.
Okay. All right, let's go to the, whoops, excuse me, last one here.
Threes are winning it so far.
Yeah. Yes, I suspect that's true, Clark.
Yeah, Clark wrote, yeah, quite
Depends
variable in parts of the valley.
Depends on where you are, yep.
I think even by community or by even initiative, I would even say I could see that.
Yep.
If it's all nonprofits or if it's just government, I can see some definite variations.
Yep. So let's jump on here. So let me just say something before we go into this last piece of this conversation here. Is in the Civic Capacity Index, we've done a condensed version of it here. There are 52 items in the index itself in these 7 different domains. So it's much more detailed, takes a little bit more time, takes about 10 or 12 minutes for a person to complete that. So I just wanted you to know that the instrument itself is more detailed than this, and that for our purposes, we sort of condensed it here and did a quick assessment. So if we look down this, you know, we can see collective leadership came in somewhere around 3. The confronting systemic injustice came in at 1 to 2, somewhere in there. Institutional synergy, say 3+, engaging civic culture around 3, organic coalitions around 4, purposeful collaboration around 3+, learning together around 3. So, you know, we could say there's probably an average here. In total, we came out about 3 on this scale of 1 through 6, you know, if we looked at civic capacity as a whole. So just, we've got, I think, about 5 minutes together before some closing from Andrea, and just some questions for you to think about here. And we may not have much time to pursue these, but put them into the conversation here. see what you think. Some of you may want to respond on chat. Others, if you have something to say verbally, that's great. So the questions I put up there is, when you see these answers coming out, about 3 on these various dimensions and 3 overall, what's noteworthy or surprises you about these results? What are the implications for you about making progress on civic challenges in the Roaring Fork Valley? What would you do with this information? What do you do with it? What does it mean for you? And the last part, what might you do to enhance? If you thought that, you know, when I asked that earlier question about the spectrum of from top down, sort of expert driven to community driven, you said you like to be way over on the right. So the implication of that, you know, might suggest to me that you would also say, if we're a 3 on this scale of 1 through 6, we ought to be doing something to enhance civic capacity in the Roaring Fork Valley. What might be done to do that? So I'll just throw it open to you. And really, this is, in many ways, this is a start of a conversation, or could be the start of a conversation for you collectively. And I'd be happy to facilitate it, be happy to help you take the Civic Capacity Index, the whole thing, to do it with a wider group of people than you have on this, to figure out how to explore these things. But let's just take the last 3 or 4 minutes we have as a group here, and you all share any ideas that might respond to these questions. And if I have anything to add, I'll do it. But the conversation is really yours.
Man, I'm wondering what's going on in your head.
I think I have a lot. I have so much going on in my head, but I'm just thinking, like, where would we start building trust to have a diverse population participating, and as a way to build our civic capacity?
Well, just a quick idea, Nan. We've thought about using that here in Colorado at various levels, and there's other people outside of Colorado that want to use a civic capacity assessment as a starter for the conversation you just described, you know, as the artifact that you push off from.
And do you think that those conversations are regional to start or community-based to start? Because I live in one part of this region and I work in another part, and the tension is pretty intense.
Yeah. Well, you know, my guess is those conversations are useful at each of those areas, and that, you know, that's work that you all would have to do to figure out where's the most appropriate place for us to start.
You know, I think the comments that Nan made and also that Michelle just made, I think speak to underlying socioeconomic and sometimes related, sometimes not, political tensions up and down the valley that I think speak to the need to do it both. You know, I think you actually have to have this at a local conversational level where you're trying to understand where are we as a community, but then you also need to sort of scale it up and say, okay, how are we doing within this context as a region? And I think part of the reason we have to do that is because communities need to be able to sort of look themselves in the eye in terms of their own civic capacity and willingness to engage and partner on some of these things. And if it's sort of, I feel like that might help. I'm not sure.
Yeah. My first response, yes. I think you have to do that at probably multiple levels. And your idea, I think, too, is that we anticipate the Civic Capacity Index as a way to get a picture in front of people that they're not likely to confront otherwise. You know, somebody coming in and lecturing them and says, you obviously don't have the civic capacity to do this, or something like that's probably not going to be very helpful. But if you have some data like this, it can often provide you a place to start.
relatedly, it's hard to make the case sometimes for the value of building civic capacity and collaborating and those things. And there's different philosophical frameworks, I think, looking at that in different parts of the valley. And,
Yes.
And so that's, I think at some level, there needs to be some creation of that type of capacity.
Right. So just a quick comment on that. We know enough now. I mean, we as human beings know enough now and have done enough research to tell us. I put some working premises up there earlier. I said that community-driven change, one of the reasons people are moving towards it, because it seems to be more effective in making lasting progress. Here, we have some evidence that shows that is beginning to show that's so. So it's not so much, a matter of ideological opinion, although that's certainly a piece of it, but we have some data that says, this really does work better here. And on top of that, it's more democratic. And on top of that, the people that do it this way observably respond better to challenges and disruptions. And you can see it.
I recently read a really interesting article in the New Yorker about civic leadership and directly, how Vermont handled the coronavirus. And it was talking about the trustworthiness of each neighbor, and that states, here I was looking at it, it says only 38% of Americans say they completely trust their neighbors, but in Vermont it was actually 78%.
Wow.
And so, starting from within and your neighbor and creating those relationships and then working your way out was really successful for them. And I found that.
Would you mind sending the reference to Andrea? I'd love to see that.
Can we just put it in the chat?
Sure. I read the New Yorker, but I missed that, and I'd sure like to see it. So that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, boy, David, I'm like Nan. I'm just going, whoa! Like, where do we start? Who's going to lead a charge, right? Who's that role that could maybe take a thing and prioritize? How can we do a better assessment of our community and even by individual communities, and then bring it together to look at it regionally? And I'm looking at Clark, I'm looking at Nan, I'm thinking of other people in our community that, like, how do we do this, right? And I think and I was even a private message to Nan, let's talk, right? And, and Clark and I have been talking, and a few others. So I just love staying engaged to try to keep that, the thoughts so that the momentum can build. And I think that's just a big piece, David, of what I think you've just generated thought for all of us is just how do we generate more of this and do more of this well so that we can create that sustaining change that we're all kind of out there, with that shared vision or value that we see is needed here in our community, but across, multiple communities for that matter, and share, and then use best practices, right, across these communities.
Yep. Well,
So,
just, I guess, a parting comment. We are beginning to pilot the use of the Civic Capacity Index and starting to have conversations in different communities. It's available. If you want some help with some of this, let us know. This comes out in part of the Prevention Research Center at Colorado State University and the Colorado School of Public Health. So it's Colorado grown. And anyway, I appreciate your time, and I appreciate your willingness to experiment a bit with this. And we may want to be calling on some of you too, as perhaps a pilot site or for some of the validation work we need to do with this instrument. So thank you again, all of you, for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
well, thank you so much, David, for joining us today, and everybody who is part of this conversation. And I'll get this recorded. I'll share it on the Roaring Fork Leadership YouTube's channel, so that'll be up probably in the next couple hours for those that I know missed it. So again, thanks for being here today. I look forward to collaborating with all of you in the future. And again, every Tuesday, noon to 1, I hope you continue to join, and just rfleadership.org, and you can check our events to see what's coming up next. So thank you again. You all have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.